It is spring 2007. Bandmates had just gotten together after a successful first album, In a Fever You Can't Sweat Out, and had decided to finally, after about a year of exhaustive touring, sit down and work on a second album. What even better to do it and by getting a cabin and going away from everything, all the noise of touring for a while, just with the bandmates, to write that second album. They come back and still at least a little satisfied. They start dropping hints to the media, to their fans, about what is to be expected for this upcoming second album. They hired the legendary producer to come up for their second album, which still was not named yet, and start to begin work, but still realize that something is missing. Now, leading up to that moment, they had been saying that this album sounds good, it sounds like a fairy tale, it even sounds like a concept album. Their producer, Rob Mathis, was brought on. It was an exciting time. But suddenly, by August, all of the work that had happened, all of the songs that had been planned, were ultimately scrapped. The band got together, had to make some changes for the release time, and wanted to reapproach the concept for the second album altogether. In so doing, they got back together, they ran away again for a second time, and when they came back, they had found the sound for the second album. In March of 2008, the album Pretty Odd, and let me kind of, since we're listening to it, Pretty.Odd. was released. Now, of course, by now you know who I'm talking about. I'm talking about Panic at the Disco and their second album, Pretty Odd. This album is extremely divisive among Panic at the Disco fans. A lot of critics compare it to the first album, and then, of course, the fallout of what happened after this album, and say that this album was the reason why Panic at the Disco, as they knew it, was no more. But a lot of people say that it's just something different. And a lot of musicians, a lot of people that are kind of music purists say that this album is a work of art. Now, I'm going to say this in one of the promotions videos that I'm going to make for this video. Panic at the Disco is not an indie band. But this album, I would say, is definitely along the lines of an indie album. Now, to kind of explain why, I need to set up kind of a little bit more of the story leading into this one. Because if you don't know, Panic at the Disco's first album, A Fever You Can't Sweat Out, was released in 2005. This album was massive, and Panic at the Disco's members were still only teenagers at the time. In fact, they had just graduated from high school 1 month before being noticed by members of Fall Out Boy, and then, of course, brought on to tour and support this album. But it was definitely punk rock. It infused a lot of pop. It infused a lot of techno beats at the time. You know, it was unique, but at the same time, it fit almost perfectly to what was happening in punk rock at the time. Now, again, let's fast forward to Pretty Odd. Instead of continuing their vision of Panic at the Disco at the time, they decided to not only, of course, rework the songs and start over, but they decided to take an absolutely new look at the musical direction and style that they were going for. And that includes everything. From the instruments that were actually used to the style. You could say that this was more a psychedelic styled rock album similar to the Beach Boys, maybe even Baroque pop album similar to the Beatles, which of course they give a lot of credit to, and a lot of people that listen to this album say that this is reminding them of those bands. And even with their own band, they decided to get rid of the exclamation point that was happening, which fans, again, was very divisive at the time. A lot of fans, they love the exclamation point in the name. In fact, there's a lot of interviews, it's kind of funny, where the bandmates are directly asked about that, getting rid of the exclamation point, and they try to make light of it, but you could tell that people had a problem with it. Now, what is on Pretty Odd? Let's kind of go through the song list here. Now we have We're So Starving, and I feel like I need to point out, I'm not going to go through absolutely every single track here, but some kind of highlights here. But I got to highlight the very first song, We're So Starving, which not a lot of people know it. But what's interesting is the lyrics, of course, has Brandon Urie sing, "We're so sorry that we've been gone." They've been gone for a long time. They were busy writing songs. And what's kind of funny is about halfway through the song, he starts saying, or he starts singing rather, "You don't have to worry because we're still the same band." And they repeat it a couple times. And that's almost tongue in cheek because the sound that they had now was completely different. So it's kind of a reassuring thing, but at the same time, again, it was almost like a playful use of wording there. Now, the second one, which is the lead single off of this album, and it's the biggest single off of the album to date, even one of the biggest Panic at the Disco songs, is 9 in the Afternoon. A very simple song, very straightforward, heavy piano, guitar, drum, lining behind it. And, catchy lyrics. Brandon's voice really shines here in this song. And again, it's one of the biggest Panic at the Disco songs. But we're going to circle back to this song here in a second. Other highlights in the middle of the album include She's a Handsome Woman, That Green Gentleman, Things Have Changed, the slow ballad, which is also kind of a sleeper hit for Panic at the Disco, Northern Downpour. And then it gets really weird. You get the nice song, When the Day Met the Night. That's a pretty simple, straightforward love song. Then you get Pas de Cheval, The Piano Knows Something I Don't Know, Behind the Sea. She Had the World, From a Mountain in the Middle of the Cabins. And then the album ends with Mad as Rabbits. Now, there are a couple songs in between, too, that I skipped, but in general, that is the entire album of Pretty Odd. Now, I said that it gets kind of weird, either through the musical style and the instruments that are used or the lyrics, kind of starting around the 7th, 8th track all the way to the end. And what's interesting is the lead guitarist and kind of the big creative brain of Panic at the Disco at the time, Ryan Ross, he wrote pretty much all of the entire second half of that album. There is a little bit of credit to the other band members at the time, especially their bass player, John Walker. And Brandon Urie has a song almost right at the end called Folkin' Around, but everything else is Ryan Ross. And that's kind of noteworthy because a lot of people, and you're going to see why, but they credit Pretty Odd and even the musical direction of Panic at the Disco at the time, not really to Brandon Urie, but more so to Ryan Ross. Now, of course, this album was released and people noticed the difference in sound. And like I said in the intro, people had opinions about it. A lot of people were disappointed. A lot of people just were shell-shocked. They had no idea that Panic was going to do something like this, completely change the sound of the album. And the boys of the band stuck to their guns. They didn't back down. A lot of people, too, kind of say Brandon Urie did, which I'm going to get to in a second. But if you watch a lot of the older interviews, especially Ryan Ross, but I will even give credit to Brandon Urie, the boys really stuck to their guns, saying like, hey, we're proud of this work, we support this work, and we're glad we made this album. Now, of course, because the album was so different, critics did like it. They gave it pretty favorable reviews, whether like 4 out of 5 stars or like 7, 8 out of 10. But there was a lot of confusion and a lot of mixed critical response to this. One kind of interesting theme that kind of rings throughout as well is a lot of people at least gave Panic at the Disco credit for being so bold to change their musical style. It would almost be a slam dunk for them to just make another Fever You Can't Sweat Out, a second one. And they would achieve massive critical success. But a lot of people say, like, you know what, at least they had the courage to make a second album. And like I said, a lot of music purists and a lot of musical journalists and articles actually love this album, and said it's thought-provoking, its lyrics are different, the music composition itself is just absolutely amazing. You got Baroque pianos going on to heavy string and horn usage, full orchestra, it was just a bold move. And what's even interesting about that is some people criticized that and said, well, they're just ripping off the psychedelic music of the 60s with the Beatles. That's all this is. It's another Sgt. Pepper, but a cheap knockoff of it. So you just couldn't win, and sadly, the sales kind of backed it up. It really did not sell very well. It did stay a hit record for a while, but it just quickly dropped off, especially considering their first album was triple platinum. So they got a platinum hit, especially with the success of 9 in the Afternoon, but then it kind of just quickly faded away. But what's interesting is this album has really gained a cult following. In fact, in 2019, which if you think about it, this album was released in 2008, so 11 years later, this album was actually certified platinum. So it did build the traction. But we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. The last part of this video, the fallout of Pretty Odd. What happened? Well, a lot of this is left to kind of be interpreted. After touring for this album, Ryan Ross and John Walker, which of course, like I said earlier, Ryan was the big brains behind this project, left Panic at the Disco. Now, like I said in the beginning, Panic had dropped the exclamation point for their name before touring and releasing this album. But after Ryan and John left, the exclamation point was returned to the name. So again, you got to wonder, a lot of these decisions, were they made by Ryan Ross, with Brandon Urie at least kind of faking the support, and then as soon as Ryan was gone, Brandon, immediately started changing a lot of things back to where they were again? I don't know. A lot of their stage presence too, because a lot of people know as fans, during their first album, they had the huge circus act, right? They had ballets, they had a lot of weird kind of Halloween-esque things happening on stage. And then for Pretty Odd, it was completely different. It was orchestra tour. Brandon didn't even have 9 in the Afternoon on that set list at some point. Now, since he has returned it, and before Panic broke up, he even included Northern Downpour, and I believe That Green Gentleman as well as part of his set list. So he didn't completely hate it, but when he answered the question, he said it just didn't fit Panic's style, and that Panic had always been a fast-paced band, and songs from Pretty Odd were just too slow and just didn't fit in. Now, of course, too, you can see, especially with the direction Panic at the Disco has gone since Pretty Odd, really the vision that Brandon Urie had for this band, where they really just did return back to that first album's roots, and just kind of went back to that punk rock with kind of glam mixes together. And that's it. Since then, they've just remained separate. Panic has not gone back together. And now Panic at the Disco as a band is completely no more. I want to hear your guys' thoughts. Now, personally, I love Pretty Odd. I think it's a fantastic album. I love the writing. I love the music. I love the composition. I love the lyrics. I love the voices of Brandon Urie and Ryan Ross. Ryan did make a push to kind of sing more on this album, so that ended up happening. And yeah, please let me know what you guys think. Was Pretty Odd good? Was Pretty Odd bad? Can we blame Pretty Odd for really the original breakup of Panic at the Disco? Please let me know in the comments. It's something a little different this week. You know, usually I just kind of stick to artists and songs. But every once in a while, I want to throw in kind of a different take, or maybe I'll kind of review an indie album in there like I did today. But that's been it for this week, and I'll see you all later.